Welcome back to another episode of the Electric Election Road Trip. I'm your host, Benjamin Backer, president and founder of the Conservation Coalition, and we are in beautiful Nashville, Tennessee on a beautiful fall day, and we're joined by the former mayor of Nashville, the former governor of Tennessee, and the current CEO and founder of Clearloop, which is an incredible story that I can't wait to dive into. Welcome to the show, Phil, and thank you for joining us. Where are we, and what is Clearloop?
Well, thank you. It's great to be here and drive carefully on your trip here. I think the idea behind Clearloop is to say that there's a lot of companies that want to do things in the space of renewable energy and greenhouse gas reduction. But most of the opportunities are there just for the big ones. I mean, big tech companies and the like that sign these long-term PPAs and build big solar arrays and so on. But for every one of those, there's 1,000 companies that want to do something. They want to have products that have got lower carbon footprint. So what we're trying to do is, with Clearloop, is to offer something to them. And you think of it basically as we use solar arrays as the vehicle. And if they wish to reduce the carbon footprint of something they make, a coffee cup, for example, or something, they figure out what that carbon footprint is, pay us a certain amount of money per coffee cup they produce. We use that then to build solar arrays that reduce fossil fuel usage in that electrical grid. That's
amazing. So when you're doing that, how do businesses find out about this, and how do they engage with you guys?
Well, we're a small startup company, yeah, and so we're around talking with businesses, and we kind of started with businesses that are really trying hard to do something green, and which is some startups and smaller businesses. But what I found as we've gotten out there is that there are a lot of businesses who've been around a while, who are being maybe pressured by people they're supplying to show how they can reduce their footprint. And this business might be making, cardboard boxes somewhere here in Tennessee. They don't have a chief sustainability officer. They don't have all these mechanics. So what we're trying to do is offer them a sort of clear, simple way that achieves their goals of being able to reduce their carbon footprint, but also does good things for communities. I mean, we build these solar arrays in rural areas and typically disadvantaged areas. It becomes a part of the tax base. It creates jobs, and companies really like that social aspect in addition to the, to the direct impact of reducing greenhouse gases.
Well, it's a really unique story because as we're kind of traveling across the country, we've really found this message that you need to have growth, economic growth in communities to really be able to invest in environmental solutions. Can you speak a little bit to that, especially as someone who has spent time in government and is now trying to work on this issue in the private sector?
Well, one of the things I like about it is, the natural place for solar isn't rural areas. It's just because the land is obviously cheaper, and you wouldn't try to build something right here, a big array. And when you do these things, what we're doing is we use entirely American suppliers. The panels are made in the United States. The racking systems are made there. Use local labor to install it. A big installation for these panels at a company like Silicon Ranch, it employs 500-600 people on site at the time. There's also ongoing maintenance with it. A big thing is in a lot of these counties, a big solar array becomes the biggest taxpayer in the county instantly. And there have been a lot of examples of schools that have hired some additional teachers out of that tax revenue and so on. So rural parts of our country are, they're under a lot of pressure economically, and this is one of the ways in which you can start to bring some of these things back.
And so, just to take a step back for a second, why does this issue matter so much to you that you've fought for it so much in your time in public office, and now you're doing it, and you've done it in the private sector for a while? Where did that love for the environment come from, and what has it been like to pair that private sector and public sector side of it?
Well, I grew up in a very small rural town, so my growing up, was fishing and hunting and wandering around in the fields and so I've always had a kind of love of the environment and of the land. And when I was governor, we did a lot of land acquisition and preservation, turning lands into public lands rather than letting them get divided up into 35-acre ranchettes or something. And I've tried to carry that on in what I've done after governor. I got really interested in solar because I do think this issue of greenhouse gases and global warming is a very fundamental issue, and that there are things you can do that help to that help to mitigate it. I've always believed that, even when there's something that requires some government central direction in some way to get it done, that to the extent to which you can do that by engaging the private sector, by creating the conditions in which you want to have private investment and private sector involvement, it's a lot healthier and a lot better than government trying to do something itself. And, solar is a good example. I mean, there are some tax incentives that have helped to get it going. There are lots of other things government could do to encourage it without incurring costs or hiring people themselves. But we've got such an inventive and smart and intelligent business community and business leaders in this country that when you have a problem, finding ways to engage them, to me, is the best possible solution.
Well, and at least in the dialogue of climate change, it seems like that private sector aspect is oftentimes a missing link because, as we've been touring around the country, we've seen small companies all the way to Fortune 20 companies that are doing climate action here and now. And they're not waiting for, the members of Congress to start agreeing on something. And I think that that's really key and it's really crucial because if you are a member of Congress and you can't, work across ideological divides, which is a whole different issue, then how are we going to solve this issue of climate change? Well, the private sector is kind of starting to pick up some of that slack. Obviously, that doesn't mean that the government doesn't have a role, but there is so much positive action that can come out of the private sector. And to your point, your company is working with other companies and it's kind of like this corporate to corporate partnership that's helping reduce emissions and then also create jobs, save people money. And that's the win-win that can come out of the private sector. And additionally, it can be scaled at a level that, Clearloop's work is new, it's a startup, but it can be scaled to the rest of the country pretty quickly. It can be scaled to the rest of the globe. And that's something that doesn't happen in, public office overnight. So, as we've traveled across the country, we feel like people are really wanting action and they feel like it's been delayed and they feel like the government's not serving their best interests on these issues, but that the private sector is kind of the best hope in the short term when the government's not acting.
Well, the whole climate change thing is something which is almost a classical case under classical economics for government involvement. There's very diffuse benefits and costs that are widely spread and so on. It hasn't happened in this country for a bunch of reasons, one of which has just been the politicization of the whole thing. But it's been amazing to me. The private sector has really stepped up, and they do it for a variety of reasons. Some of it's reputational, some of it's pressure that they're getting from investors and pension funds and the like. And actually, interestingly, I'm discovering a lot of the pressure is coming from employees. And I talked to one law firm about doing something that was not in the state. And the person who ran the law firm said, well, I don't really care about this issue, but I can't tell you how much, when we go to recruit our young associates, 30 years ago, they asked about how long can I make partner and how much money am I going to make? Now they're asking us about things like, what are you doing about sustainability? What are you doing about global warming? So there's a lot of different motivations for people doing this, but that's okay. As long as it gets done, people do them for different reasons.
Exactly. And I think that's people get hung up over why a company does what they do, but it's like if they're actually doing it and they're following through, it really doesn't matter why, as long as they're trying to make improvements to the environment. And there's a huge opportunity, I think, that consumers are missing and employees, that they don't realize how powerful their voice is, either within their own corporate community or with their dollars. And we've talked with Microsoft earlier on this trip, and they emphasize so many times the importance of their consumers and employees on this effort specifically, and that has in turn, encourage them to put billions of dollars into climate change mitigation and prevention. That is something that I really do think is missing from the climate conversation. But as you pointed out, there's also the government's role to play in it. And unfortunately, the government hasn't been doing much because of the politicization of the issue. You've served as the mayor of Nashville and the governor of Tennessee. You've also had, a lot of involvement in national politics and in the business world. What are the different roles that you see these different parts playing? The city governments, the county governments, the state governments, the federal governments, and the businesses.
Well, in terms of things like renewable portfolio standards and the like, anything to be meaningful there is going to happen at the federal level, and frankly, I don't see it happening anytime soon. Unfortunately, one of the things that I think, though, that both states and cities could do is, they too are businesses in a sense, in that a city like Nashville operates a huge fleet of vehicles. It owns all sorts of property and buildings for various things. The state, 10 times that, is just lead by example. Just show people that there are ways you can do things that help reduce your carbon footprint without inconveniencing anybody, and often by saving costs rather than driving them up. So I think right now, rather than waiting around for somebody to some epiphany to occur in the Congress, I think just people doing things by example in that way and helping to make it sort of culturally more acceptable to do these things is one of the things you could do very much at the local or state level.
Well, yeah, and I think if you can do it at the local and state level, you can be like, all right, Congress, it's your turn. Like, we've been doing it, and look at how it's been working. We've been creating these jobs. We've been boosting our economy by fighting climate change. And I think the best part about that approach is that you have local communities doing what's best for their local community. Like, Nashville knows what to do in their backyard better than someone in LA trying to tell Nashville what to do.
Well, and also, it's always better. And the nice thing about, I've been mayor and governor, and one of the nice things about being mayor is you actually have to make things work. If there's if you have a problem with crime, you do something with the police on Monday morning, not give a speech somewhere about it. You're
the CEO of your own city.
You're the CEO, and the ball stops there. And the same is really true with governors. In a way, it just is not with the Congress. And so I think that the idea of tackling some of these things in real terms, as opposed to theoretical, arguing culturally about whether you need to be vegetarian or not or something, is really important. You're facing real problems, and you've got real facilities, and you can make decisions about what you do with them and your people and so on. And just as in I've been in the business world much of my life. And I've always, one of the most important things about any successful business, I think, is that they don't sit in a cloud somewhere. They have customers. They listen to the customers. When a customer tells them they don't want something, they stop making it. Yep. And they're just tied in a way to their markets in a way that's just totally lost in Washington at the moment. But thankfully, I think cities and states still have that tie.
Well, and there's so many climate activists across the country that are young, and I personally, as a young climate activist, feel like we focus way too much on the national political scene, because even if Congress could get along, there still is a huge, long process to get something done, and there definitely needs to be that process. But to your point, you recognize a problem on a Friday in a city government, you can start to tackle it on Monday morning.
And you're so respected to it.
Right. And so, I think one thing that climate activists, I'll say this, and I don't know if you'll agree with this, but one thing that climate activists, I think, could do better is start paying attention to what is happening at the local and state level. Most Americans right now are we're in the heat of one of the most divisive elections, and actually just the past few years has been some of the most divisive years of my life, and I know for many others it's been the case. And we're so focused on Trump Biden or Trump Sanders or whatever the national dichotomy is. No one is paying attention to who their council member is or their mayor is, except COVID has kind of changed that. But, where do you think climate activists could change some of their passion towards some of those more local solutions?
I think that I've particularly since I've gotten Clearloop started, I've had a lot to do with a lot of these climate activists and the NGOs that are doing that. I think they're kind of off base in a lot of ways. They're setting up these elaborate rules because they're afraid that some company is going to cheat on them a little bit or something. What they ought to be doing is finding ways to just get people in and doing things. And take some steps forward, find out what works, find out what doesn't, instead of all this theorizing. And then the other thing is I've found, I've worked on a bunch of commissions and stuff over the last few years since I left the governor's office, and it's really interesting to the extent to which really intelligent people sort of reflexively look to Washington and legislation and money in Washington as the solution to every known problem. I worked on a commission on state research universities, the big research universities in the state, and some of the problems they're having. And really, the federal government has nothing to do with that. I mean, they're run by the state, they're funded by the state, and so on. And yet, what everyone was doing is immediately focusing on, well, we need to go to the Congress, we need to get an appropriation for this, we need money coming from this. So I think to the extent to which people could sort of say, look, there's a lot of levels of government other than the federal government, and in fact, most of the really interesting stuff that's going on right now is going on in those local and those state governments, and they're really worth some time and attention because they could be real allies to you.
Well, and I think the story of that, where it's proving true the most, is in a couple of states where you have a Republican governor and a Democratic legislature. I'm thinking of Maryland, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire specifically. And those three Republican governors are working with the Democratic legislature, and those three states are reducing emissions more than any other states in the country. And it's because they're kind of doing it at that state level. Of course, there are local governments that are working on it too. We were just in Baltimore, and there's some awesome work going on in the cities too. But there is a lot of power to those sorts of solutions. And if we only are relying on the federal government, it just is it doesn't really get us anywhere. And to that point, I think where to your kind of add on climate activists, there's a problem right now where there's a lot of like pledges and a lot of like hope about like doing something by some year and then signing off on that and saying that's good enough, instead of actually doing the action to get there. And so it's like yes, it's important for us to be a part of the international conversation on climate, but signing an international agreement that doesn't have any binding rules isn't necessarily going to solve the issue.
Like happened in Paris. I mean, everybody's putting all of this hope in that, and there's very little to it. It's totally aspirational with no teeth to it, and people are going to continue doing what they were doing. You need to find other ways to get at these things.
And you've served and lived and helped lead one of the states that people see as conservative. But you're a Democrat, and you've been able to work across those ideological divides here and also paired it with the private sector. What has that been like, and how can people take what you've learned from working across the aisle?
I think there are ways in which you can do that. I mentioned earlier on in our conversation about a lot of land conservation efforts, and we bought hundreds of thousands of acres here in Tennessee and stuff. And that was just a case of not worrying about motivations. I mean, liberals wanted me to buy the land because we were preserving species habitat. Conservatives wanted me to buy it because they wanted their kids to be able to go hunting and fishing in the future. Well, that's fine. I mean, it's the motivations are different, but in some ways they're all motivated to do that. When I first got started with as governor with solar, I worked at it as an economic development tool. And I said to people, I don't care whether you believe in climate change or not. Some people do. Jobs are going to be created out of this kind of thing. Let's have the jobs here in Tennessee. And you can get people from all sides of the political spectrum say, well, okay, if there's if this is an opportunity for jobs here, especially in some of these rural communities that are suffering, great, go ahead and do it. So, I think if people stop sort of politicizing everything or trying to argue that everybody ought to see their motivation as the correct one for doing these things, and just say that there can be different reasons why people want to do this. I mean, there may be corporations that couldn't care less about climate change, but they got customers that they think they can get more business out of because they're being sensitive about this. Well, fine, I'll take it.
That's exactly right. And to that point, I mean, there's different motivations for everyone. And that's like psychologically, it's an intrinsic, your motivation is an intrinsic thing that you've, kind of built up throughout your life. I mean, people who grew up in, rural areas have different motivations than people who live in more urban areas. And that doesn't mean that you can't find the same end goal, to your point. Like, the people in the urban areas tend to want to protect more of the land so that they can go visit it and relax there. And the people who live in those areas want to be able to recreate there and hunt there and fish there. And you can have the same outcome with different motivations and not vilify each other over where those motivations come from, because you're never going to change someone's intrinsic motivation that they have grown up, having their values based on.
Yeah, I mean, these kind of ways you see the world, they don't change these. I mean, whether you're a liberal or conservative, you're not going to change your view on climate with a PowerPoint presentation. It's not going to happen. So, So what you ought to do is find out, well, there are some ways in which you can get things that are important in your world out of this, and you can get things that are important in your world out of this, and let's take that and move forward.
Well, if you tie those bonds, without trying to do a PowerPoint presentation, you go into a community that really cares about hunting and fishing, and you relate climate change to hunting and fishing, then you're getting somewhere. Or you go to a farmer and you talk about climate change as it pertains to farming, then you're getting somewhere. But if you're just trying to kind of change people's minds without understanding where they're coming from or what their background is, you aren't going to get anywhere.
Yeah, I would say I've known a lot of activists on all sides, and I just always say to them, stop telling people how to think about something. That's objectionable and it's arrogant and everything else, except the fact that people have made their conclusions about some things. Now, given what they believe and what we believe, is there some way that we can find a path in here that does something for both of us? And with things like like renewable energy and so on, it can create jobs, it can create especially tax base in some of these rural communities and so on. So the people who are doing it for that reason they may not be interested in climate change 100 years from now, but it means a lot to them to have those jobs and those extra teachers in the schools, that kind of stuff.
Right, and you can have buy-in from different communities for different reasons on climate too, and it doesn't even have to be directly related to reducing carbon emissions for climate change. It could be embracing clean energy in your local community because it creates jobs, and by the way, it also reduces carbon emissions, which is a great added benefit. So we only have a couple minutes left. Before we started talking, you talked about Oak Ridge National Lab in Tennessee, and there's so much movement towards the different energy sectors that are cleaner than the traditional fossil fuels. Where do you see the energy kind of development going in the next couple of decades? Where do you think it should go, and how is Clearloop going to play a role in that?
Well, I think first of all, I think that replacing conventionally generated electricity, whether it be with coal or natural gas, with other more renewable, greener forms, is really, first of all, essential. It's a quarter of all emissions in this country. There's more emissions from the electrical grid than there are from every car and every truck and every airplane in the country. So I think that it's really important to do that. And the nice thing about it, it's low-hanging fruit. The technology is there. You don't have to invent some new technology to do this stuff. You know about solar, you know about wind, you know about nuclear for that matter, and so on. So if your interest is in really trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as opposed to imposing your idea of what an ideal society looks like on somebody else, I think there's no better place to go, no lower hanging fruit than the electrical grid. And what we're trying to do with Clearloop is real simple, which is to say there's been some advances in this thing. But remember, solar is 2% of the energy in this country at the moment. There's been some advances in that. It's largely been driven by a few very large companies who can sign long-term agreements. They got the credit rating to use those agreements to do other things and so on. And what we'd like to do is open it up to all the rest of those businesses, everything from the mom and pops to there's a lot of Fortune 500 companies that are not in a position to do those big contracts, but can do something like what we're proposing, where you can step into it, step out of it as you want to. You're not making long-term commitments, but you're making a difference.
Well, I think you hit on one of the problems there, which is that, and one of the biggest frustrations for me and our organization as we've been going across the country, is that this issue of clean energy development has been so politicized when it's something that pretty much everyone can get behind, and everyone is behind in some way, shape, or form. The polling shows that, and yet we can't seem to even try to unite on it because people are politicizing it for their own good, and then we actually aren't getting anywhere politically, environmentally, economically. And people in Tennessee want clean energy. People in South Dakota, where we were just a few weeks ago, want clean energy. But it's seen as this political wedge issue when, unlike other issues, it really just has no bearing on, politicization, or it shouldn't at all. And so that has been one of the biggest problems with the climate change movement. And then, of course, there have been, obviously interests on the other side that have been putting in money to make it divisive too. But this isn't divisive. Clean energy development is not divisive for local communities. It lifts people up. It creates jobs. It transitions people from, really tough jobs to better jobs, higher paying jobs. It brings families from low income communities up into the middle and upper class. There's so much potential here. and yet we're still stuck bickering about whether or not clean energy is okay, on the conservative versus liberal lens. And that is just absolutely infuriating to me.
I think people who care about greenhouse gas emissions stuff ought to just, take a word from the business schools. I mean, you go to business, if you went to business school, I didn't, but, one of the things you're going to learn is successful companies don't tell people what I want to sell you. They try to find out what their problem is and how I might apply what I can do to helping solve your problem and get your things done. I'd say the same thing to this. I mean, if you want to get clean energy deployed, stop telling people why you want to do it, and find out how you might be able to in some way help them with what it is you have to offer. It isn't always going to work, but boy, my experience has been that there's plenty of places where it will.
Wow. That is one of the best statements I think I've heard on this trip. And I would love to end it there, but we've ended with a question every time, which is, what do you hope we learn over the rest of this trip, as we still have about 2.5, 3 weeks left, and we're starting to hit the southeast and then back over to the southwest? What do you hope we see over the last few weeks of this trip?
I think, I guess I would hope that you would see a lot of people who would, whose motivations and the way they talk and think about things would start to put to rest this lie that it's this highly politicized, needs to be this highly politicized issue. I think there are people on all sides of the political spectrum, from all different walks of life, for whom this stuff can have some meaning in different ways. And I think one of the most important things that you could do on a trip like this is to find those people and show them to the world that it's like everybody who's who's for solar is not a crazy lib somewhere who thinks we all ought to be vegetarians and whatever, and everybody who's against it is not some Neanderthal with their knuckles dragging on the ground to do it. There's different people who've got different motivations, and I think the task of leadership is it's not finding ways to divide people, it's finding ways to find common ground and unite people. And I think what you can do is you have an opportunity here to take some real leadership in this climate debate.
Well, our viewers just heard it from somebody who has lived it and been successful at bridging that divide and actually hearing people out. And you had to represent an incredibly diverse state with a lot of, big metro areas and a lot of rural areas. And there's not many states that kind of have that, the significance of both of those all in such a small area. I mean, it's pretty impressive what you've been able to do. And I'm very thankful for your leadership on all of this, because it will take the cities where you've helped lead, the states which you've helped lead, and the business community which you've helped lead to solve this challenge. And so if we're going to look for climate solutions, it'll come from people like from the people at Clearloop and you, Governor, and really grateful that you even took the time to speak with us as we're kind of going across the country and getting here in Nashville. But it's a beautiful day, and it's a beautiful October day to talk about markets and climate change and how we can solve this together.
And Clearloop, don't forget.
And Clearloop, and of course Clearloop, which is going to be a huge force now that you've kind of started getting off the ground. And I know you've built solar arrays all over the United States with Silicon Ranch, and now you're helping out with all these other Fortune 500 companies and small startups. This is the way forward, and really, really excited to see what Clearloop can do over the next couple of years. And to our viewers who are tuning into the Electric Election Road Trip, thank you for tuning into another episode. We are on our way to Charlotte, North Carolina, where we hope you'll join us for our next episode on the Electric Election Road Trip.